The dress tore clean across the back seam, loud enough for the entire dining room to hear. Not an accident. Nadia Reyes had worked in restaurants long enough to know the difference between a hand that slips and a hand that grips and pulls with purpose. And the hand that had closed around the fabric at her left shoulder blade and yanked downward had been deliberate in the specific way that only certain kinds of people were deliberate. The kind who had learned early that they could do things to other people in public and be protected from the consequences by the simple fact of who they were standing next to. The seam gave in one clean motion, the sound of it cutting across the ambient noise of a full Friday dinner service, the murmur of conversation, the clink of silverware, the low jazz from the speakers in the corners. Everything paused for exactly 2 seconds. Then the room did what rooms do when something uncomfortable has just happened in them. It went back to its own noise, slightly louder than before, the way people raise their voices to cover what they have just witnessed. Nadia did not move for a moment. She was holding a water pitcher in her right hand, in the middle of refilling the table at booth 7, and she kept holding it at the same angle she had been holding it when the seam gave way. Because the water had not stopped needing to be poured just because something had just been done to her. She filled the glass. She straightened. She set the pitcher back on her tray and turned around to look at the woman who had done it. And what she saw was a woman in her early 30s, in a dress that cost more than Nadia's monthly rent, with the expression of someone who had just performed an action they had been planning for longer than they would admit, and who was now waiting for a specific reaction that would justify the action retroactively. The woman's name was Vivian Cross. Nadia did not know this at the time. What she knew was that Vivian was the girlfriend of the man in the suit across the table from her, a man she also did not know by name, but whose face she had catalogued the way she catalogued everything in her section: table placement, posture, level of hunger, likelihood of ordering another round. He was Carter Blake, though she did not know that either, and he was looking at Nadia with an expression she could not immediately read. Not embarrassed and not apologetic, but something more complicated and more careful. The look of a man processing information quickly and deciding what to do with it. He glanced down at her left hand, at the pitcher, at the ring she wore on her 4th finger, and then he looked back up at her face, and something shifted behind his eyes that she caught and did not yet understand. "Oh no," Vivian said, in a voice that contained no trace of the apology. The words implied. She looked at the tear in the back of Nadia's dress with the clinical interest of someone assessing damage they have caused and found satisfactory. "I am so clumsy. Did I do that?" She reached out again, not toward Nadia, but toward the fabric, as if to examine it. And Nadia took 1 step back. That was not a retreat, but a boundary. A single step that placed her outside the reach of Vivian's hand without requiring a word to explain it. The dining room, which had returned to its own business, had not returned to it as completely as it appeared. Nadia had worked this floor for 7 years. She knew what occupied attention looked like, and half her section was occupied with the precise attention of people who are looking at something while performing the act of not looking. She said, "I'll let the manager know," and she picked up her tray and walked toward the service corridor with the same pace she always walked. Not fast enough to suggest flight, not slow enough to suggest she was waiting for something. Behind her, she heard Vivian say something to Carter in a lowered voice, too low to catch, and she heard Carter respond with 2 words that were also too low. She pushed through the service door and let it close behind her. The corridor was bright and narrow and smelled like the kitchen. Garlic and clean heat, and the edge of the dishwasher, steam. And Nadia set her tray on the steel shelf by the door and stood for a moment with her hands flat on the surface and looked at the wall in front of her. Her back was cold where the fabric had separated. The tear ran about 8 inches along the seam. Not enough to compromise the dress structurally, but enough that she could not go back on the floor in it. She was thinking about this in the practical way she thought about all floor problems. What was the immediate solution? What did she need to do in the next 4 minutes? When she noticed that Dario, the host, he was already at the far end of the corridor with his phone in his hand. He was not looking at her. He was looking at his phone with the focused attention of someone sending a message that needed to be sent quickly and accurately. And when he finished sending it, he looked up and met her eyes, and the look on his face was not the look of a host who was alarmed about a customer complaint. It was something quieter than that, more internal. "I'll get you something from the back," he said. "Emilia has a spare jacket. It'll cover it." She nodded. She knew Dario had worked for her husband's family for 11 years. She knew that the message he had just sent had not gone to the restaurant manager. She changed in the staff room in the 3 minutes it took Emilia to bring the jacket. A clean black blazer that was slightly too long in the sleeves, but covered what needed covering. And she sat on the bench in front of the lockers and looked at the tear in the dress and thought about what had just happened with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. Starting from the outside edge and working inward, a woman had grabbed her dress and pulled. The woman had done it deliberately. The woman was with a man who had looked at Nadia's left hand before he looked at her face, and the look that followed had contained information he was choosing to keep to himself. These were the facts in the order she had them. She was still working out what they added up to when her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. The text was from a number that appeared in her contacts as a single initial. M. It said, "Are you all right?" 3 words, no punctuation, which was how Marco always texted, because he had never been a man who used punctuation in informal messages, and the absence of it had stopped feeling like brevity and started feeling like his particular voice. She looked at the message for a moment. She typed back, "Yes, fine, uniform issue, handled." She waited. The 3 dots appeared, and then stopped, and then appeared again, and then his reply came, "I know about the uniform issue. I'll see you at home." She put the phone back in her pocket and sat for another moment in the staff room and thought about the fact that he had texted her before she had told him anything. She thought about Dario at the end of the corridor with his phone. She thought about the message she had watched him send with the focused attention of someone who knew it needed to be accurate. She thought about the 7 years she had worked this floor, and the 3 years she had been Marco's wife, and the careful architecture she had built to keep those 2 facts from occupying the same space. Not because she was ashamed of either of them, but because the overlap was complicated in ways she had never fully worked out and had found it easier to avoid working out. She thought about the man in the suit at table 7 who had looked at her ring before he looked at her face. She thought about what he had recognized in it and what he had decided to do with that recognition, which was, as far as she could tell, nothing. She put the blazer on. She went back out to the floor. She finished her shift with the same cadence she had started it. Table to table, water glasses and bread baskets, and the check when the table was ready for it. And she did not look at booth 7 again until the couple there had paid and left. The table was clean. The tip was generous in the specific way of people who feel they owe something but are not going to say so out loud. She folded the bills and put them in her apron and went to her next table and did not think about what the generosity meant, or what the man named Carter Blake, though she still did not know that name, had recognized in her ring and chosen to keep to himself. She drove home at 11 in a city that was still fully awake. Manhattan doing what it always did past midnight. Taxi horns, and the lights from the lobbies of buildings that never fully went dark. And she thought about Marco's text the whole drive. "I know about the uniform issue." Past tense. Declarative. The voice of a man who has received information and has processed it and has arrived at a position about it before the conversation has happened. She had been married to him for 3 years, and she knew that voice the way she knew his silences, which was to say, she knew it well, and she did not always know what was behind it. She pulled into the garage of the building on Park Avenue. That was not how she had imagined she would live when she was 22 and working lunch shifts in Queens. And she turned the engine off and sat in the quiet for a moment. She was not afraid of the conversation waiting for her upstairs. She was something more complicated than afraid. She was standing at the edge of something she had been stepping back from for 3 years. The place where the two parts of her life would need to look at each other directly. And she had not stepped back from it tonight because she was a coward. She had stepped back from it because she had not yet found the language for it. She was not sure she had the language now either. But she was going upstairs, because that was where Marco was. And because whatever the language was going to be, she was going to have to start finding it somewhere. She got out of the car. She took the elevator. She went inside. Marco was in the kitchen when she came in, not waiting for her in the living room with a particular expression, not standing at the window with his back to the door the way men in his position were supposed to stand when they had something to say. He was in the kitchen with 2 plates on the counter and a pot of something that smelled like the chicken stew his mother had taught him to make. And he looked up when she came through the door and looked at her for a moment, with the specific quality of attention he had brought to every room she had ever walked into, the attention of someone who was always running a quiet assessment and had learned to do it without appearing to. She set her bag by the door. She took off the borrowed blazer and draped it over the back of the chair. He saw the tear in the back of her dress. He did not say anything about it. He turned back to the stove. "Eat first," he said. It was not a question. She sat down at the counter and watched him move around the kitchen with the efficiency of a man who cooked the way he did everything else, without wasted motion. And she thought about the text message, "I know about the uniform issue," and about what knowing looked like when it arrived through Dario's 11-year-old loyalty, rather than through her. She thought about the shape of the information he had received, which was not the shape of the information she had. She ate the stew, which was good, the way it was always good, and she did not offer the evening up for discussion because she was not sure yet what she wanted to say about it. And she had learned in 3 years that Marco was a man who would wait. Not because he was patient in any soft sense of the word, but because he understood that the right information arrived faster when you did not chase it. He sat across from her with his own plate, and they ate in the particular quiet that was not uncomfortable, but that had a texture to it tonight. The texture of 2 people sharing a space that also contains something that has not yet been spoken. She noticed that he had not asked her how her shift was, which he usually did. He had not asked her anything. He had given her food and let her sit, and he was watching her in the way she had stopped, noticing over 3 years, and had started noticing again tonight, the way he always watched her, as if she were the most important piece of information in whatever room he was in. She said, "What did Dario tell you?" He set his fork down. He looked at her. That a woman at booth 7 grabbed your dress and pulled the seam. That you walked off the floor without reacting. That the man at the table with her watched it happen and said nothing. He paused. And that the man at the table looked at your ring before he looked at you. She nodded. That was accurate as far as it went. What else? That is what Dario saw. He looked at his plate, then back at her. What I read into it may be different from what Dario saw. There was something in his voice that she had not heard in it before. Not often. A kind of careful restraint that was not his usual stillness. His usual stillness came from certainty. This came from something that was working against certainty and not entirely succeeding. "The man at that table," he said, "who looked at your ring. Do you know who he is?" No. She had not asked, and no one had told her. She had worked the table as she worked any table. He was quiet for a moment. He picked up his fork and set it down again. A small movement. The kind he made when he was thinking through something and had not arrived at the place he wanted to arrive at yet. "I have a meeting scheduled for next Tuesday with a man named Carter Blake." He has been attempting to acquire a portion of the Reyes portfolio for the past 8 months. The meeting is to discuss terms. He looked at her steadily. I believe Carter Blake was the man at booth 7. She thought about the man in the suit, the way he had processed her, the glance at her ring, the 2 words he had said to Vivian that she had not caught. And his girlfriend did this on purpose. She said, "Not a question." I believe it was intended to create a basis for complaint about the restaurant, to establish a pattern of negligence or poor management before the meeting. He said it evenly, the way he laid out all business information, with the calm of someone who has separated his analysis from his response to it and was presenting the analysis first. It is a strategy, not a sophisticated one, but it has been used before in acquisition negotiations. Manufacture a problem with the asset's operations. Use it to argue the asset is overvalued. She looked at him. But you think it might also be because someone told them who I am? Pause. A longer one than she had expected. I thought that at first. He said, when Dario's message came in, my first reading was that someone had found out about you and that the incident was targeted specifically at you. Not at the restaurant. He held her gaze. But the more I think about it, the less I think that is what happened. Because if someone wanted to hurt you specifically, they would not do it with a dress in a restaurant full of witnesses. They would do it differently. His jaw moved slightly. And because the way Dario described what happened, the way you walked off the floor, the way the woman looked at you afterward, it reads like someone who did not know what she was touching. He paused. It reads like someone who thought you were simply a waitress. The words simply landed in the room with a weight she had not expected. She turned it over. Simply a waitress. She had worked that floor for 7 years. Long before Marco. Long before Park Avenue. Long before any of this. And the work had never been simple to her. It had been precise and physical and demanding in ways that people who had never done it did not understand. And it had been hers in a way that nothing in the other half of her life had been hers in quite the same way. She thought about the word simply and thought about the woman at booth 7 who had used it in the structure of her action. The assumption built into the grip and the pull. The assumption that the person whose dress she was tearing was a person who would absorb the tearing and move on because there was nowhere else for the tearing to go. She said, she was wrong about that. Yes, Marco said. Something shifted in his expression. A fraction of a degree. The specific fraction that meant he was feeling something he had decided not to perform. She was wrong about that. They finished eating. She washed the dishes because she had always washed the dishes. Not because the alternative was not available to her, but because the routine of it was something she had carried from her parents' kitchen and had not wanted to leave behind. He dried them and put them away, standing beside her at the sink, close enough that she was aware of the particular warmth of him that she had also spent 3 years being aware of, and they did not talk for those few minutes. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the kitchen had its own rhythm, and neither of them wanted to break it just yet. She hung up the dish towel. She turned to look at him, at this man she had married, who moved through the world with the particular gravity of someone who had made decisions others could not make and lived with them. And she thought about the architecture she had built between the 2 halves of her life and how long she had been telling herself it was holding. Marco, she said. He looked at her. What would you have done tonight if Dario's reading had been right? If someone had done that to me because they knew who I was? He was quiet for the length of a full breath. Something I would not want you to see. He said, not a threat, not a performance. The simple, factual answer of a man who had just been asked to describe the part of himself that he had spent 3 years keeping on the other side of a door she had asked him to keep closed. He had kept it closed. He was keeping it closed now. But the door was right there, and they were both standing in front of it. She nodded. She had known the answer before she asked. She had asked because she needed to hear it, said plainly. outside of the careful architecture, where it would have to exist as a real thing in the real air of their kitchen. She walked past him toward the hallway and then stopped and turned around. The meeting with Carter Blake. She said, "Next Tuesday." He waited. "I want to know how it goes." His eyebrows shifted by a degree that was small and meant more than it appeared. "I'll tell you," he said. She looked at him. "I mean, I want to be there." The room was quiet. The refrigerator made its small mechanical sound. The city outside the window was doing what it always did and not caring about this conversation, which was the same as it always was. Marco looked at her with the full quality of his attention, the kind she had spent 3 years being the object of and had not always known what to do with. And he said, "Nadia." She waited. He said, "That meeting is not the kind of meeting you want to be in." She said, "Carter Blake's girlfriend put her hands on me in a room full of people because she thought I was someone who could be put hands on without consequence. I would like to be in the room when he finds out she was wrong." A long pause. He looked at her in the way he looked at things he was deciding about, and she held the look and did not look away, because she had stopped looking away from things she needed to read. A habit she had picked up somewhere in 3 years of marriage to a man who communicated in the gap between what he said and what he meant. He said, "All right." She went to bed before he did, the way she usually did, and she lay in the dark of their bedroom and listened to him moving quietly through the apartment. The sounds she had memorized without meaning to. The click of his study door. The low voice of a phone call that was brief and businesslike and ended before she was close to sleep. She thought about the woman at booth 7 and the grip that had been deliberate and the specific assumption built into the deliberateness of it. She thought about Tuesday. She thought about what it meant that she had asked to be there and he had said all right, and what it meant that in 3 years of careful separation, tonight was the first time she had asked. She was still thinking about it when she fell asleep. The meeting was set for 11 in the morning in a private dining room on the 2nd floor of the restaurant. Marco had explained it to her over coffee on Sunday, not as a briefing, not with the clinical remove she had seen him use when discussing business with other people, but in the way he explained things to her when he wanted her to understand rather than simply to be informed, with context and with pauses where she could ask questions if she needed to. Carter Blake's acquisition interest centered on 3 properties in the Reyes portfolio, all of them commercial, all of them in Manhattan, none of them. The restaurant itself. The restaurant was not for sale and had never been offered. It was on the list Carter's people had assembled, because Carter's people had been told that assembling a complete list made the seller feel respected. Marco had let them think this was working. It was not working. It was giving him a map of everything Carter wanted, which was different and more useful than a map of what Carter had been told he could have. She dressed for Tuesday the way she had learned to dress when she needed a room to look at her and make an assessment before she had said a word. Not the uniform. Dark trousers. A silk blouse in a color that worked with the light in the 2nd floor room at that hour of the morning. The jewelry she wore when she was not working the floor. She put on her rings. Both of them. The engagement ring and the wedding band. The wedding band, with the crest that she had been told once, carried a specific meaning in specific circles and had not fully understood until much later. Marco looked at her when she came into the kitchen and said nothing, which was the kind of nothing that meant more than most of the things he said. They arrived before Carter. Marco took the seat at the head of the table and she sat to his right, which was where she understood she was supposed to sit without being told. The position that was not a concession and was not a display, but was simply the most accurate physical representation of what was true. 2 of Marco's associates sat further down the table with documents she did not look at. The room was set for a working lunch. Water glasses and a coffee service, and the particular formal readiness of a room that has been prepared to contain something serious. Carter Blake walked in at 11 exactly, which told her he had been told to be on time and took being told seriously. He was taller than she had registered in the restaurant, which was often the case with people she had catalogued primarily as table-level problems, and he looked at the room. The way someone looks at a room they have been anticipating, assembling and comparing to the version in their head. He looked at Marco. He looked at the associates. His gaze moved along the table and arrived at her and stopped. He recognized her in the space of half a second. She saw it happen. The same processing she had watched from below on Friday night. The same rapid assessment. And this time, she could see the full sequence of it because she was facing him at eye level. He recognized her face. He recognized the blazer she was not wearing this time. He recognized the ring. Both rings. And his attention went to the crest on the wedding band and stayed there for a fraction longer than it had in the restaurant. Then he looked at Marco, and whatever he read in Marco's face completed the calculation for him. He pulled out his chair and sat down. Vivian was not with him. She had not expected Vivian to be there. This was a business meeting and not a social occasion, but the absence of her was its own kind of information. Confirmation that Carter had made a decision about Friday that did not include his girlfriend and had not included her since, at least the time he had recognized the ring and understood what recognition meant. The meeting proceeded the way Marco had said it would proceed for the first 40 minutes. Carter's team presented their interest in the 3 properties. Marco's associates responded with figures and timelines. She sat and watched and listened and did not speak because there was nothing yet for her to speak to. She was learning the room the way she learned a floor section on the first shift at a new station, mapping the dynamics, measuring the distance between what people said and what they meant, watching for the places where the conversation carried more weight than its surface suggested. Carter was good at this. He was present without being aggressive and specific, without being committal, and she could see why he had built what he had built. The particular intelligence of a man who knew exactly how much to show and when to stop showing it. At 43 minutes, Marco set down his coffee and said, "I want to address something before we continue." Carter looked at him. Marco looked back with the evenness she had spent 3 years learning to read. "My wife was working at the restaurant on Friday evening." He said it without emphasis on any particular word, which was how he said things he intended to land heavily. "I understand you were there for dinner." Carter held very still. "Yes," he said. "I was," Marco said. "Then you were present when something happened to her." Carter said, "I was." The 2 syllables were level and without defense, which told her he had prepared for this moment and had decided that preparation was the only thing he could offer it. Marco said, "Did you know who she was when it happened?" A pause. "A longer one," Carter said. "I suspected. I confirmed it when she turned around," Marco said. "And you said nothing." Carter looked at Nadia, not to deflect, not to perform an apology through eye contact, but with the direct acknowledgement of a man who has been asked a question and is answering it to the correct person. He said, "No, I did not say anything. I should have." She held his gaze. He did not look away. She said, "What did you say to her after?" Carter was quiet for a moment. "I told her to take the table's card." He meant the credit card he had given Vivian to pay, the one that had produced the generous tip. "It was inadequate," he said. She said, "Yes." He did not argue. Marco let the moment exist without rushing past it. He was good at this also, at the uses of silence, at letting what had been said occupy the space it needed before the next thing arrived. Then he said, "I am not going to continue this negotiation." Carter looked at him. "The properties you have identified as points of interest represent approximately 31% of the portfolio you have mapped. I have been aware of your mapping process for the past 6 months. I have allowed it to continue because I was interested to see the full picture of what you wanted before deciding what to do with that information. He paused. What I have decided is that I do not want to sell to you, Carter said. On the basis of Friday, Marco said. On the basis of several things. Friday is among them. He looked at Carter without hostility, with the same evenness with which he looked at everything. But Friday is the one I am choosing to name. Carter was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the table. He looked at Nadia. He said, "That is your right." He said it with the specific flatness of a man accepting a consequence he had understood was coming, since at least the moment he walked into the room and saw her sitting at Marco's right hand. He looked at his associates, and something passed between them that resulted in papers being gathered and put away. The particular efficiency of a team that has been told to be ready for this outcome and was ready for it. He stood. He looked at Marco. "I appreciate your time." Marco nodded once. Then Carter looked at Nadia and said, "I am sorry about Friday. That does not cover what happened, but it is what I have." She looked at him and thought about the tip on the table in the restaurant and the 2 words he had said to Vivian that she had not caught, which she now suspected had been the words, "I know." And she said, "I know you are." He nodded. He left. The door closed. The associates began organizing their documents with the quiet efficiency of people who understand when a room needs a moment and are providing it. Marco looked at her from the head of the table, and she looked at him from his right, and between them was the particular quality of a silence that follows something that has just been done and cannot be undone. Not a silence of uncertainty, but of arrival. She thought about 7 years on the floor of that restaurant. She thought about the jacket with the sleeves too long. She thought about 3 years of careful architecture and where she was sitting and what it meant to be sitting here, not as a visitor to his world, not as a person who had wandered through a boundary she was supposed to stay on the other side of, but as someone who had looked at the boundary and decided to walk up to it and stand there, and Marco had made room for her to stand. She reached across the table and picked up the water glass that had been sitting in front of her untouched for the past hour and drank from it, because her throat was dry in the way it got when she had been paying very close attention for a sustained period of time. And because the action of picking up the glass and drinking from it was so entirely ordinary that it made the room feel ordinary again in a way that was neither deflation nor anticlimax, but simply the return of the normal that was waiting. On the other side of the significant, she set the glass down. She looked at Marco. He was watching her with the expression he sometimes had when she did something that reminded him of why he had married her, which was an expression she had learned to recognize at some point in year 2 and had never been able to fully describe. She said, "What happens to the 3 properties now?" He said, "They stay in the portfolio. They were never going to leave it." She said, "And Carter Blake?" He said, "He will find other assets. He is not without options." She said, "And Vivian Cross?" Marco looked at the door through which Carter had just departed. He said, "I think Carter Blake is probably having a very specific conversation with Vivian Cross right now, and I do not think it is going well for her." She thought about that. She thought about Vivian in the restaurant with the grip that had been deliberate and the expression of someone who had performed an action and was waiting for it to justify itself. And she thought about the fact that the justification had not arrived in the form Vivian had intended. She said, "Good." Marco looked at her. She looked back. She said, "That is the first time I have said that about something in your world." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "How does it feel?" She considered the question with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. She said, "Like it fits." Vivian Cross called Carter at 2:17 in the afternoon. He did not answer. She called again at 2:21 and again at 2:34, and the pattern of the calls. The specific interval between them. The way they arrived before he had fully processed the previous unanswered one. Told Carter everything he needed to know about the state she was in, and nothing he did not already know about himself. He sat in the car outside the building on Fifth Avenue where the meeting had taken place, and he looked at the phone on the seat beside him, and he thought about the woman he had seen in the restaurant on Friday evening, and the woman he had seen sitting at Marco Reyes's right hand this morning, and the fact that they were the same woman, and that he had known they were the same woman since the moment she turned around from booth 7, with the water pitcher still in her hand, and he had looked at the crest on her ring. He had known from that moment. He had said 2 words to Vivian. "I know." Too quiet for the waitress to hear. Vivian had looked at him with the expression of someone who has just been told something they do not yet understand. He had said, quietly, "Her ring." Vivian had looked at the waitress's left hand. She had seen the crest. Vivian did not know what the crest meant. Carter had not told her. He had taken out his wallet and given her the black card and said, "Pay the check." And he had not explained anything else, because there was nothing to explain in that room at that moment that would have changed what had already happened. And because he had needed to think before he said anything that could not be unsaid, he had spent the weekend thinking. He had spent 4 days in the specific company of the knowledge that he had been in a room when something was done to someone and he had not stopped it. Not because he could not have stopped it, but because stopping it would have required acknowledging that he had not stopped Vivian from planning it in the first place. He had known, in the way you know things, you do not say aloud, that Vivian's choice of the Reyes restaurant for Friday dinner was not coincidental. He had known that she intended to find a reason to create a complaint. He had not known she would go as far as she went, but he had known the direction she was moving in, and he had not redirected it. And in the space between not knowing and not redirecting was a failure he had been sitting with since Saturday morning. He did not answer the third call either. He put the phone in his jacket pocket and looked at the building and thought about Nadia Reyes sitting at a conference table in a silk blouse with her rings on both hands and the particular quality of stillness she had brought to the room. The stillness of someone who has decided exactly how much of themselves a given room is permitted to see, which was a quality he recognized because it was a quality he also practiced, and which had looked entirely different on her than it looked on him. On him, it was professional habit. On her, it was something that had been earned in a specific and expensive way that he did not fully understand but could recognize the shape of. She had listened for 43 minutes, and she had not moved, and she had not looked away, and she had not been performing patience. She had been paying attention the way people pay attention when the information matters to them directly, and they are not going to miss any of it. The phone buzzed. A text this time, not a call. He looked at it. The text said, "I need to talk to you." He put the phone back in his pocket. He told the driver to take him to the apartment on Lexington, which was not the apartment Vivian had a key to, which was the point. He sat in the back of the car and watched Midtown move past the window, and thought about 3 things in the order they arrived: the crest on the ring, the stillness at the conference table, and the way she had said, "I know you are," when he had offered his apology. With the tone of someone who is accepting something as accurate, without deciding yet whether accuracy is sufficient. He did not know if accuracy was sufficient. He thought probably it was not, in any meaningful sense. The sufficient version of Friday would have been the version where he leaned across the table and said, "Vivian, don't," which he had not done. The sufficient version of Friday existed only in the version of events where he was a different kind of person than he was. And he was old enough and had spent enough time in enough rooms to know that wishing you were a different kind of person was the least productive use of an afternoon he could imagine. What he could do was not repeat the failure. What he could do was be in rooms like the one this morning with the clarity of someone who understood what was at stake and had decided to act on that understanding. He could not undo Friday. He could decide what Tuesday meant going forward. The car stopped at a light. He took out his phone. He called Vivian back. She answered on the first ring, which meant she had been holding the phone. He said, "I'm not coming home tonight." She said, "Carter," he said, "what happened at the restaurant was not something I can explain away, and it is not something I want you to explain to me. I know what happened, and I know what you intended, and I know that you did not know who she was." He paused. "I did know who she was, after the fact, and I did not say anything, which is a different failure, and one I am also going to have to think about." Vivian was quiet on the other end. He said, "I do not think we should continue what we are doing." She said, "Because of a waitress." He said, "Because of a great many things, most of which I should have said before Friday, and because of what Friday made clear about both of us." Silence. Then she said, in a voice that was smaller than her usual voice, in the voice of someone who has had something removed that they had been using as a structural support, "And she is the wife of Marco Reyes." He said, "Yes." She said, "You knew and you said nothing." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" He thought about the question. He said, "Because saying something would have required stopping something I should have stopped earlier, and I was not ready to do either." It was the most honest thing he had said to her in 8 months of being together, and he recognized the irony of it arriving in this particular conversation. He heard her breathing. He said, "I am sorry, Vivian, not for ending this, but for the parts that led to it." She hung up. He did not call back. He arrived at the apartment on Lexington and sat on the couch in the room he used when he needed to think, without the noise of the version of his life that had accumulated around him over the past 3 years. The version that included Vivian and the dinner parties and the specific performance of having arrived that he had been giving for so long. He had sometimes confused it with actually being somewhere. He was 42 years old, and he had built something real and something hollow simultaneously, and had not fully distinguished between them until this afternoon. The real parts were the companies, the work, the decisions that had required actual intelligence and actual nerve. The hollow parts were the rooms he had walked into for the purpose of being seen walking into them, which was a different and less interesting thing. And Vivian had been part of the hollow parts in a way he had not let himself examine, because examining it would have required the kind of honesty he was apparently only capable of in the aftermath of having handled something badly. He thought about Marco Reyes, who had ended an 8-month negotiation in a single sentence and had named Friday as the reason, with the particular honesty of someone who could have used a more opaque reason and chose not to. He thought about the associates who had been ready for the outcome, the papers already gathered before Carter's chair scraped back. He thought about the level of preparation that implied, and what it said about how long the decision had been made before the meeting began. He thought, not for the first time since the restaurant, about the woman at booth 7 who had walked off the floor without reacting and had finished her shift and had shown up 4 days later at a conference table with her rings on and had listened to 43 minutes of a negotiation involving her husband's portfolio without once looking like she was anything other than exactly where she was supposed to be. He did not know her. He had been in her presence for a total of perhaps 2 hours across 2 separate occasions, and on neither occasion had she done anything except be entirely herself in a way that required nothing from him or from anyone else in the room. But he thought about her because she was the point where something had become clear that had not been clear before, and he was the kind of person who paid attention to the points where things became clear. It was the skill that had built the companies and the work and the real parts of what he had made, and he was using it now on himself, which was overdue. He called his assistant and said he would need the afternoon cleared. He sat in the quiet of the apartment on Lexington, and he worked out what the next version of things was going to look like. Not in the sense of what he was going to do tomorrow, but in the sense of what he was going to stop confusing with what he was building. He was still working this out when his phone buzzed with a message from his attorney, which was about the Reyes negotiation, and which he read and set aside because there was nothing to respond to. The properties were not going to be acquired. That was the conclusion of a process that had revealed more about what he did not want than what he did, which was, he supposed, the most efficient possible outcome of 8 months of work, and he had paid for it with something he could afford to lose, which was the relationship, and something he could not afford to ignore, which was the specific quality of the failure he had made at Booth 7 on a Friday night in front of a room full of people who had gone back to their own noise, slightly louder than before. He did not know what Marco Reyes had said to Nadia when she came home that night. He did not know what she had said back, but he thought, sitting in the apartment on Lexington with the afternoon light coming through the window, at the angle it came through at that hour, that, whatever they had said to each other, it had produced the woman who had sat to Marco's right this morning and looked at Carter with the assessment of someone who had already decided what the room contained and was verifying it. He thought that was the result of 3 years of something, of 2 people having built something together that could hold a Friday and a Tuesday and come out on the other side of both, still pointing in the same direction. He thought about the tip on the table. He thought about "I know you are," said, with the tone of accurate rather than sufficient, and he thought that accurate was probably a more honest place to start than most people ever got to. He put the phone on the coffee table. He looked at the ceiling. He thought about what sufficient might look like, going forward, in the parts of his life that were his to decide about. He was not sure yet. He thought that not being sure yet was, for now, the right place to be. She went back to work on Thursday, not because she had to, not because anyone had asked her to, but because the restaurant was hers in a way that had nothing to do with the portfolio or the deed or the crest on her wedding band, and because staying away from it because of a Friday would have meant giving the Friday more weight than it deserved in the long accounting of her life. She wore the uniform. She tied her hair back the way she always tied it. She took the same route she had taken every Thursday for 7 years. The subway to 53rd and the 3 blocks east. The particular smell of the city at 8:30 in the morning that was different from any other time of day. Exhaust and bread and the cold that was starting to sharpen at the edges now that October had arrived in earnest. Dario was at the host station when she came in. He looked at her the way he had looked at her since Friday, with the specific quality of someone who has sent a message he is not sure he should have sent, and is waiting to find out whether the sending of it was the right thing. She said, "Good morning, Dario." He said, "Good morning." She went to the back and put on her apron and started her prep the way she always started her prep, the particular sequence of tasks that made a section ready for service, which was a sequence she had done so many times it existed in her hands rather than in her head, and which she found, this morning as she had found for 7 years, quietly satisfying in the way that things you are good at are satisfying when you stop thinking about them and let them happen. The morning service was steady. She worked her tables and she did not think about the conference room or the rings on her hands or the question of what it meant that Marco had driven her to work every day since Tuesday. He had not announced this as a new policy. He had simply appeared at the door at 7:45 on Wednesday morning with his car keys and the particular expression of a man who has made a decision and is presenting it as a fact rather than a proposition. And she had looked at him and picked up her bag, and they had gone downstairs together without discussing it. The same had happened this morning, and she thought it was likely to happen tomorrow, and she thought she did not mind it, which was itself a kind of information, the kind that settled into you quietly rather than arriving with the noise of a realization. She was at table 12 at 11:45 when she heard the door and looked up and saw a woman she did not recognize come into the restaurant and speak to Dario. And Dario glanced at her across the room in a way that was not alarmed, but was attentive in the specific way he was attentive to things that required her to know about them. She finished pouring the coffee at table 12 and walked to the host station. The woman was in her late 40s. Dark coat. The quiet presence of someone who moved through the world without needing it to notice her. And she looked at Nadia with a directness that was not unfriendly, but was entirely without the social coating most people layered over a first meeting. She said, "You are Nadia Reyes." It was not a question. Nadia said, "Yes," the woman said. "My name is Elena Carver. I am Carter Blake's mother." She paused. "I would like to sit down. If you have a moment." Nadia looked at her. She looked at the quality of her coat, at the hands that were holding a small bag with the particular stillness of someone accustomed to waiting, at the directness that reminded her, with a small internal jolt of recognition, of the way certain people in Marco's world looked at you. People who had been in rooms for a long time and had learned that the fastest way through was usually a straight line. She said, "I have a moment." She led Elena to the corner table at the back, the one she used for conversations she did not want the room to hear, a habit she had developed without naming it, and which Marco had once noticed and not commented on. Elena sat. She set her bag on the chair beside her. She looked at the restaurant with the assessment of someone who had been told what it was, and was now calibrating that information against what she saw. And what she saw appeared to satisfy her in some way, because her shoulders settled by a fraction. She said, "My son told me what happened here last Friday. He told me what he failed to do and what he did afterward." She looked at Nadia. "He did not ask me to come here. He does not know I am here. I came because I have spent 42 years watching Carter make good decisions and poor decisions, and I have learned to tell the difference. And what he did on Friday was a poor decision, and what he did on Tuesday was a better one. And I wanted to say to the person most directly affected by the poor decision that I am sorry for it, as his mother, which is a specific kind of sorry that is different from the apology he has already offered you." She paused. "I am also here because I was curious about you. That part I will admit to directly." Nadia looked at her for a moment. She said, "What were you curious about?" Elena said, "About the person who walked off that floor without reacting and showed up 4 days later at a negotiating table and looked at my son as if he were a problem she had already solved." The corner of her mouth moved. "Carter has not had many people look at him that way. I thought the person who could do it was worth meeting," Nadia said. "I was not trying to be anything in particular in that meeting," Elena said. "I know. That is why it worked." She looked at the coffee service on the table and then at Nadia, and something in her expression shifted to a warmth that was different from the directness. A warmth that was maternal in the specific way of women who have deployed it strategically for decades and still mean it. She said, "Will you have coffee with me? I promise I will not keep you from your tables." Nadia sat down. She poured the coffee. She told Amelia by the service corridor with a look to take table 12 for the next 15 minutes. And Amelia understood, because Amelia had been watching the corner table since Elena sat down and was already moving. She drank her coffee across from Carter Blake's mother, and they talked. Not about Friday and not about Tuesday, but about the restaurant, about the neighborhood, about what it looked like in the early morning before the city fully woke up. And Elena Carver listened the way people listen when they are actually interested. And Nadia found herself talking about the things she had not talked about with anyone outside of Marco in a long time. The specific quality of the work, the way a floor section looked when it was running well, the 7 years of it that were hers regardless of anything else. When Elena stood to leave, she looked at Nadia with the direct warmth and said, "Thank you," Nadia said. "For the coffee," Elena said. "For the conversation." She left without looking back, which was the manner of someone who did not require confirmation that they had made the impression they intended. Nadia watched her go and stood at the host station for a moment, and thought about what it meant that the week had contained that conversation as well as the others. The accumulation of rooms and people and moments that had each required something specific of her, and each of which she had moved through on her own terms. She went back to her tables. Marco picked her up at 3. He was parked in the same spot he had been in on Wednesday. Engine running. And she got in, and he looked at her the way he looked at her, and she looked back, and he said, "How was service?" She said, "Good." A woman came in this morning. Elena Carver. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Carter Blake's mother." She said, "Yes." She apologized for her son, and then she had coffee with me and asked me about the restaurant. Marco looked at the street ahead. He said, "What did you think of her?" Nadia considered. "She reminded me a little of you," she said. He turned to look at her. "In what way?" She said. She said what she meant and did not explain herself unnecessarily. He looked at her for a long moment and then looked back at the road, and the corner of his mouth did the thing it did that was not quite a smile, but was the direction of one. They drove for a few blocks in the quiet that she had learned over 3 years was not the absence of conversation, but a form of it. The kind between people who had built enough shared context that silence carried information as efficiently as words. She looked at Midtown moving past the window, at the city, doing what it always did, and she thought about the week in the order it had happened, the seam giving in one clean motion, and the water pitcher still in her hand, and the blazer with the sleeves too long, and then the kitchen, and the stew, and the text that had already known before she told it anything, and then the conference room with the rings on both hands, and then this morning with her apron tied and her section ready, and everything in the sequence it was supposed to be in. She said, "I want to talk about something." He waited. She said, "Not tonight. Maybe. But soon?" He said, "All right." She said, "I have been thinking about the 2 parts of my life and whether I want them to stay as separate as they have been." He looked at her. She kept her eyes on the street. "I do not think I want that anymore. I do not know exactly what I want instead, but I think I want to figure it out with you rather than around you." The car moved through the intersection at 49th Street. He said, "I have wanted that for a while." She looked at him. "Since when?" He said, "Since before you asked for it. I was waiting for you to be ready." She thought about that. She thought about 3 years of careful architecture and the long patience of a man who had kept a door closed because she had needed it closed and had been waiting, with the specific quality of his waiting, for her to tell him she was ready to open it. She said, "I should have been ready sooner." He said, "You were ready when you were ready. That is how it works." She looked out the window at the city that was the same city it had been on Friday, indifferent and unceasing and fully itself, and she thought that she was also the same person she had been on Friday. The 7 years on the floor and the 3 years on Park Avenue and everything that existed in the overlap between them. The person who had poured the water and finished the shift and gone home and eaten the stew and asked to be in the room and sat at the right hand and told Carter Blake, "I know you are, and come back to work on Thursday." She had not become anyone new. She had simply stopped pretending that the 2 parts of her were not already the same person. They pulled into the garage. Marco turned off the engine. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the car, and he sat beside her, and neither of them moved. The way neither of them had been in a hurry this week. The way you are not in a hurry when you know the conversation you are about to have is one you are going to keep having for a long time. She opened the door. She got out. He came around from the driver's side and they walked to the elevator together. And she pressed the button for their floor. And the doors closed. And in the small moment before they opened again, she thought about Friday morning and how she had not known. Standing at table 12 with the water pitcher in her hand, that by Thursday the week would have produced this, which was 2 people in an elevator going up to the same floor. Neither of them pretending the other one was not there. The doors opened. They went inside. She put the kettle on. He sat down at the counter. They began.